Welcome to everybody to the first virtual version of the Bradford seminar. We are pleased to have with us today Robert McLeman. Robert characterizes his research as exploring the human dimensions of environmental change with particular attention to the relationship between environment and human migration, community adaptation to climate variability and change, and fostering citizen participation in environmental science. Robert received a PhD in geography from the University of Guelph after receiving his MS in environmental management and a BA from Western Ontario. Robert's done more than his share of community service, having served in the Canadian Foreign Service in diplomatic missions in Belgrade, Hong Kong, New Delhi, Seattle, and Vienna, and advising many intergovernmental organizations and governments on issues related to climate change, migration, and security. Notably, he's also currently coordinating lead author for IPCC's Working Group 2 Sixth Assessment Report. His research and his voice have provided a valuable context for understanding climate-related migration, to what extent it can be viewed as one adaptive response among many, how migration in response to climate change can be understood against the background of historical and ongoing migration arising in part from natural climate variability of the past, and what lessons these previous episodes provide when we consider the future. Please join me by the way, Bob's talk today is entitled "The Coming Exodus?" Global Migration Flows in a Changing Climate. Please join me in welcoming Robert McLeman. Now, usually we'd all applaud here, and you can't, or at least you won't be heard, so I'll applaud.
Thank you very much, Michael. And Michael, I assume you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So that means I'm going to assume that everybody else can. So thank you, Michael, for that introduction. And I should point out that it's a real honor for me to be introduced by Michael to those who are listening, because Michael's been doing the IPCC beat for a long time now. And much of what I've learned about how we do global assessments about climate change, I've learned from meeting Michael and people like him. So it was a real pleasure. I should mention that there's might be some students from Wilfrid Laurier University from my first year environmental studies class who may be joining us on this call today. Hello to you. Normally we would meet for a lecture today, but that's not going to happen, obviously, in these changing times. But they will also perhaps recognize you, Michael, because there's a video that they watched for one of their lab assignments in which you are interviewed by NBC television about climate change and some basics on it. So your face might actually be familiar to some of my students. Let me thank Princeton University and Keely and Chuck, who are on this call in particular, for organizing this. I was supposed to come in late November, early December last year for this talk, but we had one of the few big snowstorms of the year struck Eastern North America that day. And so I never got to come down, and so we tried to schedule for this weekend, and now there's something else going on in the news that prevented me from traveling to New Jersey. But thank you all for inviting me to speak virtually to Princeton, and maybe one of these days I'll actually get down there. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start sharing a slideshow on my screen with everybody, and I'll try to look into the camera, although I sometimes glance out of the corner of my eye. It's not because there's anything going on there, that's just where my notes are. So I'm going to do that right now. And hopefully you will all be able to see my PowerPoint slide, and I'll rely on Keely to let me know if you don't. Otherwise, I'm just going to proceed as if you can all see this and hear this. And I have numbered all of my slides in the lower right-hand corner, and we'll try to, from time to time, just mention that out loud, just so that my voice and the slides coincide with one another. And I should mention that there is a chat function that goes along with Zoom conferencing. And if anybody wants to interrupt, or interrupt in the sense to ask a question or for points of clarification, just send me a chat message. Hopefully it'll pop up on my screen, and you will all get a chance, you'll get a chance to speak to me. And we'll do a Q&A at the end of this as well that Michael will launch once we get there. I plan to speak for about 40 minutes, although that is a live audience timing, so I might go faster just because I'm kind of speaking into a bit of a void right now. But anyhow, so thank you very much for joining me. In case you're wondering what else I do, if you want another version of this, a shorter version of this talk, there's a 10-year-old TED Talk still out there on the internet if you want to watch that. If you spell my last name correctly, you'll be able to get that. And also there's a number of different books that I've written or edited over the last few years about this subject that I spend a lot of time studying, which is the relationship between climate and human migration. And so just to give you an overview of today's talk, I'm going to start by talking about some of the key risks related between climate and migration. And when I use that terminology, I use it because it's what's being used in the latest IPCC assessment report on vulnerability, impacts, and adaptation. They talk about key risks associated with climate change. I'm going to talk about some future projections and scenarios for climate in the coming years and how it's going to affect global migration patterns. I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications for the United States and Canada, particularly in terms of policy, and I'll be talking about some of the more international policy dimensions as well, followed by a Q&A. So the topic that I'm talking about today, climate and human migration, is one that pops up a lot in the media. And so whenever I give one of these talks, I tend to just sort of scan the last 30 days and see if there's been anything published about it in the news. And this particular blog posting from the Council on Foreign Relations came out in this past month, just a couple weeks ago, and it asked the question, how should the world respond to the coming wave of climate migrants? And I don't know Stuart Patrick, but I read the blog posting. It's actually quite good and it's worth a read. But it's just an example of how this is a very topical subject. Just some other things that you might see in the media. You'll often see reporters trying to find where are the first climate change refugees or climate migrants, and what will the future hold. So here's just two stories that came out of the media in the last couple of years. One is the migrant caravan that we saw come out of Central America last year. Then there was a question, is climate change one of the drivers of that caravan? Another one, I like the story in the top left-hand part of the screen. This was in the Toronto Star. It was, could climate change herald mass migration? And the question was, could it cause mass migration of refugees from the southwestern United States to the northeastern United States and southern Ontario, the Great Lakes region, where water would not be in scarce supply in coming decades? So just some interesting stories people have reflected upon. The first thing we need to keep in mind is that it already happens that climate-related events and extremes already displace people and trigger migration, relocation, and evacuations around the world on an ongoing basis. So we're not talking about a hypothetical phenomenon. We're talking about something that happens all the time. There's an organization called the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center based in Europe. They have a website, idmc.org. And what they do is they track displacements for reasons related to conflict, to natural disasters, and to development projects. And so what you see on your screen now, we're on slide 6, is a map that shows displacements recorded in the 30 days prior to March 18th when I put the slide together. So these are all fairly recent. So if you look, for example, on the map, you've got brown circles that relate to conflict, but you have blue ones which relate to weather-related disasters. So for example, in the United States, you'll recall that in the past month there were severe tornadoes that blew through Tennessee and other parts of the South. And so that's what those circles there capture, for example. So it already happens. And if you go to the next slide here, you'll see that this is 2018 statistics, which are the most recent that are available right now from IDMC. You'll see that there were about 16 million weather-related displacements in that year. And the big three were storms, which was responsible for 9.3 million people, floods for 5.5 million people, and then followed by droughts, wildfires, and others, which were in the hundreds of thousands in that particular year. The interesting thing about these statistics is that IDMC has been keeping them for over a decade now, and 16 million people displaced by weather-related events is kind of par for the course. There's variation from year to year. It goes up as high as the mid-20s and sometimes as low as the low teens, but so 16 million people per year is fairly common. Now, not all of those people migrate. A lot of those people who are displaced end up returning back to the places where they lived. But it gives you an idea of the fact that people are forced on a regular basis in many parts of the world to leave or move out of their homes because of factors attributed to the weather and therefore over the long run to climate. And if you look at where these displacements take place, in 2018, you'll see that the Philippines, China, and India were the big three, followed by the United States, Indonesia, and others. And so what's interesting for me is two things. One is that this is pretty common. Each year you will find that the Philippines, China, India, and the US lead the way in terms of displacements. Now, the reasons vary, but if you look at the Philippines, for example, it's almost always because of extreme rainfall or storm events. China, you get flooding and storms as well. India, you get a variety of reasons. But what's interesting from a Canadian perspective, if I might, is that these are among the top 10 sources of immigrants to Canada. In fact, all four of them are in the top 5 sources of immigrants to Canada. So if you think about immigration as a network of people between sending countries, receiving countries, and then maybe intermediary countries as well, what I'm going to talk about later in this presentation is that when you get extreme weather events or climate-related disasters in immigrant sending countries, you get reverberations, I should say, through the migrant network. So there will be impacts in the receiving country. So that's something I'm going to loop back to later in this talk. The other thing is that we actually already receive environmental migrants, people who move for climate-related reasons. They don't self-identify as environmental migrants, typically, because if they were to do so, they would not be able to get legal status in the places to which they migrate. So this is what you see on the slide here is a story from the Toronto Star again. This is based on a study that a grad student and I did a few years ago working with the Bangladeshi community in Toronto. And we were asking people, forget about the legal reasons that you told Immigration Canada why you came to Canada. What were the actual reasons? And what we found is that there was a small but significant percentage of people who come from Dhaka City to Toronto primarily for environmental reasons related to food quality, air quality, and things like that. So their numbers are small, environmental migrants, and they're currently embedded within larger flows of immigrants. And one of the things we're going to wonder about is whether those numbers are going to increase in coming years because of climate change. Okay, so let's loop back to, I mentioned from the IDMC statistics, the sort of big 3 existing climate risks for migration. So the big 3 environmental drivers, if you will. And these are floods and storms, and to a lesser extent droughts, with a new one, wildfires on the horizon that are also significant, not at a global scale, but at a regional scale. So Southern California, Australia, and other parts of the world, which are inherently dry areas, have a risk of wildfires becoming a displacement factor as well. So let's start with the first of those, floods. Now, each of these phenomena leads to different sorts of migration. There's this historical tendency to think about migration as simply as a set of push and pull factors. And that very simplifies things, because what happens is when you have an extreme weather event or climate-related event, you get different sorts of migration outcomes depending on the circumstances. So for example, if you look at floods, typically they don't lead to large-scale permanent displacement of people. What typically happens is that people will be displaced temporarily, but they will want to come back to their homes, resume their livelihoods, especially if the community is still intact and they start to rebuild. The only time you really see large-scale permanent out-migration from floods is when the homes and the livelihood assets simply cannot be replaced or rebuilt, and then people will start to migrate elsewhere permanently. The next big driver is extreme storm events. Again, these are regionally specific, and the extent of migration and displacement that follows depends an awful lot on 2 factors. One is the extent of the damage to housing and critical infrastructure, and the response of the government and the authorities, the institutional capacity to adapt to those events. And so a good example of this was Hurricane Maria, which struck Puerto Rico in September 2017. The US government response to that disaster was very slow and underwhelming. And as a result, a lot of people from Puerto Rico migrated to the mainland United States. And it's estimated that 140,000 people did so in the year after Maria. Most of them went to Orlando, New York City, places that already had a large Puerto Rican community where they often joined up with extended family or friends to look for work and remit money home to Puerto Rico. And this is a fairly common outcome in response to natural disasters like extreme storm events, especially where people have the ability to move. So for example, Puerto Ricans have freedom of movement to the continental United States. An extreme hurricane that hits Haiti has a different outcome because Haitians do not have a right to migrate to the United States. But in this case, because Puerto Ricans had freedom of mobility, they did move in large numbers. And so that was a response because of lack of institutional capacity to rebuild after the fact. And then droughts. Drought is a very different driver because it doesn't come on very quickly or suddenly the way an extreme storm does. So typically what you have with a drought is you have this sort of slow unfolding of events which lead to very low levels of migration or mobility at the front end of the drought. People will typically adapt in other ways. They might look for off-farm employment. They might change the operations of their farm if they're farmers. If they're pastoralists, they'll change their movements. So you typically start with a very slow response. The initial migration response is for young people, especially, to migrate out of the drought-affected area, to look for labor, to look for wage earning opportunities, to remit that money home, and then hopefully that gets people through the drought. So there's this lag period that as conditions persist and other adaptations start to fail, then you start to see outmigration from the affected areas. And where we see droughts being an important stimulus for migration is not surprisingly in parts of the world where you have existing conditions of dryness. So sub-Saharan or Sudano-Sahelian Africa, parts of South Asia. And we used to see that in the southwestern United States and up through the Canadian Great Plains up until the 1950s. Since then, other adaptations have kicked in, so we don't see drought trigger migration on any scale that we used to in North America. And then we've got this new climate-related risk that is coming down the pipe, which is sea level rise. And so this depends a lot on future greenhouse gas emissions. And so I'm going to get into this in just a few minutes, which is what is the future going to look like. Scientists use scenarios to estimate what future sea level rise will be like. This chart that you see here is from the IPCC special report on the cryosphere and oceans as well. And so what you see here is it's projecting out to 2300. What we're interested in is out to 2100 here, which is in a low greenhouse gas emissions scenario. We're looking at about a 0.4 to 0.5 meter sea level rise. And for a high emissions scenario, looking at somewhere around a 0.884 meter sea level rise in the most recent projections. Now, what are the impacts for migration and displacement? Well, there's a couple things. One is that sea level rise will amplify the coastal impacts of extreme storms, floods, tides, and it will also salinize soil and groundwater in low-lying areas, and eventually, over the course of time, will inundate settlements that are in the very lowest lying areas. And it's been estimated that by the year 2100, over 1 billion people will live in the low elevation coastal zone around the world, which are areas that are less than 10 meters above sea level. And so that's a projections based not just on sea level rise, but also on demographic projections as well. Now, when we talk about sea level rise, there are communities right now that are situated at sea level that are already at risk. And three examples are on the right side of your screen there: Tuktoyaktuk in Canada's Northwest Territories, Kivalina in Alaska, and Ile de Jean-Charles, Louisiana. There's also some coastal communities in Chesapeake Bay that are situated at sea level. And these are all communities that will need to be relocated within the next few years, or in some cases are actually actively being relocated because they're right at sea level. Typically there's erosion and or subsidence taking place as well. And there's an urgent need to get people moved inland. Now, one question becomes, well, how much will this cost? And it's an interesting example. There's a couple interesting examples I'd like to share with you. One is, which will be familiar to people in New Jersey and the New York area, which is Superstorm or Hurricane Sandy, which in 2012 damaged a lot of coastal settlements and communities in that area. And after the storm, it was decided that the states of New York and New Jersey would try to acquire some of these damaged properties and buy them out so that people would not rebuild on these ones. An estimated 1,300 properties were purchased at an average cost of about $230,000 US per home, which is a fairly extensive or fairly expensive buyout, but it's a relatively small number of homes. If you were to look at projections for the city of Miami, particularly the Miami Beach area, it's estimated that in a high emissions scenario, up to 12,000 homes in Miami may need to be relocated or abandoned by the middle of this century. What would that cost if you used the dollar value of the properties that were reacquired in New Jersey and New York? That would be $2.7 billion US would be needed to relocate just the homes in the area of Miami that would need to be relocated. The second example is one that's actively ongoing right now. This is a community called Ile-de-Jean-Charles, Louisiana. It's a small, there's a photograph of it right there, and there's a little video link that I've put on my slides if you want to go to that. It's a small community on one of these little barrier islands out in the Gulf. It is rapidly subsiding, eroding. There's been a lot of damage to the island caused by changing of or dredging of ship canals in that area and ship channels. And so this community is being actively relocated. There's about 80 residents who are still in Ile-de-Jean-Charles. They're being moved by the state of Louisiana to an inland site. The federal government has kicked in for this, and a total of $48 million US has been allocated to this particular project, which works out to about $600,000 per resident. Now, it's estimated that up to 7 million Americans live in high-risk locations by mid-century, kind of like Ile-de-Jean-Charles that you see here. So at $600,000 per resident, it would actually cost over $4 trillion to relocate all the Americans who live in really highly exposed locations. To put that into context, that's essentially all the money that the US government spends in any given year. So essentially, it's not financially possible to relocate all Americans living within about a meter of sea level. It's simply not possible. But nonetheless, it may need to be done if we continue on the path that we're on. This is a study that came out earlier this year, the most recent one, if you're interested in following it up. It's by Robinson et al., and they modeled migration patterns in the USA under sea level rise. And on the next slide here, this is slide 26, you'll see one of the images from their study. Now, this particular one is a low probability scenario. What it's based on is an assumption of a 1.8 meter sea level rise by 2100. That is unlikely. It's not outside the realm of possibility, but it's not within the realm of probability. But if you were to raise sea levels by a meter 0.8 by 2100, the blue areas are coastal counties that would require an out migration of people. The red counties would be ones that would actually receive, based on their modeling exercises, that would actually receive population as well. So this is an attempt to kind of look into the crystal ball and see what America would look like in the future under sea level rise. So this sort of brings my sort of segue into the broader question of looking into the crystal ball, into the future. What will be our future in terms of global migration patterns under a changing climate? One study that came out in 2018 was the Groundswell report, which was prepared for the World Bank. I did a little bit of early work on this particular study. And what the conclusion of this study was that if we don't change our ways in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and if we do nothing to advance the Sustainable Development Goals between now and 2050, the upper end risks for climate-related displacement and migration, primarily within countries, would be up to 143 million people is what was projected, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in South Asia and in Latin America as well. And as I said, these all depend upon a bunch of scenarios coming together. And so whenever scientists are trying to make future projections about the impacts of climate change on migration, there's a number of uncertainties that they have to deal with. One is they obviously have to come up with scenarios for what the key climatic risks will be. What will be the frequency of extreme storms, floods, and droughts in coming decades? Second question is, what will be the development trajectories of the most highly exposed countries, especially low and middle income countries? Because there's very clear evidence that the greater your level of economic development, the more options you have in terms of adaptation at an institutional level, at a community level, and at a household level. And so you have other opportunities to adapt other than by migration. And then a third uncertainty, and this is one that's very recent where people are starting to look at it, is a question about future international migration policies. So let me quickly go into these three uncertainties. Climate scientists use something called the representative concentration pathways, or RCPs, when they're generating future climate scenarios. So these are agreed upon within the climate modeling community, that what they're looking at is, let's make some assumptions about greenhouse gas emissions going out to the year 2100, and what implications those concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere would have for global temperature change, for sea level rise, and things like that. So the fifth assessment report from the IPCC, what you see here is a chart showing projections at the upper end, which is the RCP 8.5, versus the lower end scenario, which is RCP 2.6. And looking out to the end of the century, RCP 2.6, you get a small increase in global temperatures, about 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees maximum over pre-industrial temperatures, versus an RCP 8.5 scenario where you get somewhere around 4 degrees warming over pre-industrial temperatures. Now keep in mind that right now we're about 1 degree Celsius warmer than pre-industrial temperatures. And I apologize to my American audience that I simply can't think in Fahrenheit, so I can't equate it that way. Just a quick bit of information. What are these RCPs? So I mentioned 2.6 versus 8.5, et cetera. Just to let you know that a 2.6 scenario sort of assumes that we embrace the Paris Agreement, that we get to work on it yesterday, and that we rapidly start to drive down global greenhouse gas emissions and get them close to zero later this century. Under that sort of scenario, this high action to take action on greenhouse gas emissions, we control global warming. Conversely, RCP 8.5 at the bottom of your screen, that is the scenario where essentially we just burn them if we've got them. We dig every bit of coal and every bit of oil out of the ground and we burn it. In that scenario, we're looking at more than 3 to up to 5 degrees warming by the end of the century. Just to put it into context, RCP 2.6 is rapidly fading into the rearview mirror. We definitely need to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions immediately to try and hit that one. There's literally no evidence that the global community has any strong interest in achieving those greenhouse gas emissions right now. Right now, we're on the trajectory for an RCP 6 or 8.5, an upper end warming scenario. Those two pathways start to diverge about 2050. So what we do over the next 20 or 30 years will have big consequences in terms of global warming and the impacts of climate change over the remainder of the century. And so if we look at those RCP scenarios, what do they do in terms of the key drivers for climate-related migration? Under the low-end scenario, where we control greenhouse gas emissions, the flood, storm, and drought risks around the world stay mostly the same as they are right now. If there are changes, they tend to be incremental in nature, which means that we have the ability to use existing knowledge to adjust, adapt, and manage those risks. Conversely, if we go down the RCP 8.5 road, what we see is increasing flood and storm risks in East and Southeast Asia, greater, especially under the 8.5 scenario, increasing storm risks in the Caribbean along the Atlantic coast as well, and also in the Bay of Bengal in South Asia. We see greater drought risks in Africa, except for East Africa, where you actually get a chance of more rainfall and flood-related risks. So if we go down the road of high emissions, essentially what we do is we amplify and increase the amount of risks in Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia in terms of extreme storms, and as well in the Caribbean basin and the Atlantic as well. And we increase drought risks in Africa. These are all pathways we don't want to go down, but that's what happens. Second uncertainty is future socioeconomic development. Scientists use something called shared socioeconomic pathways. These are standardized scenarios looking at what will the future be like in terms of international cooperation, development, and so forth. And so what you see here is this little chart that talks about on these different SSP scenarios, you have different challenges for mitigation and for adaptation. And there's an assumption within the SSPs that demographic, economic, and social factors influence our ability to adapt to climate change. And so these 5 SSP scenarios, SSP1 is an optimistic scenario where the international community cooperates, the SDGs are met, and we work together to deal with the challenges of climate change. Conversely, under SSP 4 or 3 and 4 in particular, you have a lot of international fragmentation, conflict, a lot of have and have not situations around the world. And each of these has implications for future global migration patterns. Under SSP1, which is a sustainability scenario, we probably have less undesirable migration. And I mean that not desirable in terms of the origins of migration, but the conditions under which migration occurs. So in other words, under an SSP sustainability scenario, we have more free migration, people migrating with agency, and we have less refugee-like migration, less forced migration, less involuntary displacement. And we get people adapting through other means other than migrating it under conditions of distress. At the other end of the spectrum, under SSP 3 and 4, which are situations of international fragmentation, inequality, and conflict, typically what will happen under those scenarios is you'll have larger numbers of people moving, often internally within low-income and middle-income countries, lots of involuntary displacement, and you also get large numbers of people who are trapped in situations where they might want to or need to migrate, but may lack the means to do so. So I've got my little traffic light there to align with the various SSP scenarios. And if you're curious about that, there will be a publication coming out this year of a study in which I sort of went through these in detail. The final uncertainty is migration policy options. And this is something also I've been trying to work out on myself and a couple other people as well. And we sort of looked into the crystal ball and said there's 3 different ways that the international community might move in terms of migration policy. One is managing migration, so actively facilitating safe and orderly and regular migration between countries and make it easier for people to remit money from one country to the next. The second one is sort of the current status quo, which is a global hodgepodge of migration policies and programs. And then the third one is to double down on the current trend in many high-income countries, which is to try and control migration, to fortify borders, to even criminalize migration in some instances, which is a sort of an attempt to try and control the movement of poor people and unskilled people and only allow highly skilled, wealthy people a high degree of international mobility. And again, under each of those sort of scenarios, what we see looking forward is that that under a managed migration scenario, we have less distress migration, less trapped populations, and migration becomes part of a development solution around the world. At the other end, we see a lot of negative things starting to come out of that. Unfortunately, one of the main trajectories right now around the world amongst high-income countries and even amongst middle-income countries is to try and control borders. And so the images you see here are from the India-Bangladesh border, and a photo that I clipped from the US Border Patrol's own website showing how they're testing new drone and remote sensing technology to close down the US-Mexico border. So this is sort of what the future holds for us. So what I want to do now is to start to talk about the so what question. So what are the implications for Canada, the United States, and the international community? We have this potential for large numbers of people on the move, depending on how we go forward with these different policies. One thing that Canadians and Americans need to keep in mind is that we actually need migration. The reasons for that are slightly different between Canada and the United States, but we need migration in an orderly way. For Canada, it means we need to do this to prevent population decline. For the United States, it means to meet future labor market needs. So if we look at Canada here, Canada has an aging population, and immigration has been the primary driver of population growth in Canada going on 2 decades now. And after the year 2050, the share of Canadians who are retirees, who are essentially over the age of 65, will be up to 1/4 of the population. And in the absence of migration, our population ages and declines after 2050. So we actually need high levels of migration in the future. Right now, Canada takes about 300,000 immigrants each year. We will probably need to bump up those numbers in coming decades. The United States, it's a little bit different. your population is slightly younger than ours and tends to have more children than ours. But the important part is the American labor force. Immigrants currently make up 17% of the US labor force. That includes documented and undocumented migrants. And immigrants and their children are necessary to maintain the US labor force in coming decades, especially as the baby boomers, the Gen Xers retire, and indeed for the baby boomers as their children retire. So this is necessary to maintain a healthy working population. And the next slide, if you look at the global distribution of young people, what you will see is on this map, the red and orange countries are old countries, the green and yellow countries are young countries. And what you can see is that the young people in the world are in Africa, parts of South Asia, parts of Latin America. So all these countries that I talked about, where you have these severe climate risks for displacement, migration related to storms and droughts and floods, are also areas with young populations. So the question becomes, can we make migration part of the adaptation and development solution rather than looking at it as something to be controlled and criminalized, right? So if you look at the map here, I sort of highlighted some of those areas where if we stay on the path we're on in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, where you're going to have more people wanting or needing to move. And that is, in some ways, it is a development opportunity. So the question becomes, what will be future international policies? One is climate policy. Are we going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and prevent an escalation in these climate-related drivers of migration and displacement? The United States dropped out of the Paris Agreement, so there's not much more to say about that. But Canada signed on to it. But we're kind of the worst kind of party guests in that we sign on to these things, but we don't actually follow through on them. It was the scenario under the Kyoto Protocol, and it's coming true again under the Paris Agreement, that Canada will not meet its Paris Agreement target, and we won't even come close to it. And increasingly, it looks like the rest of the world will not either. If you look at the little map that I have here, I grabbed this from the website of the Climate Action Tracker website. The countries in green are ones that are currently on track to meet their Paris Agreement. That would include Morocco and the Western Sahara. All the other countries, no, not meeting their Paris Agreement targets. So it looks like we're going to be moving towards those RCP 6 or 8.5 scenarios. So in that case, we're in a future where we're going to have more people being displaced or on the move for climate-related reasons. What are we going to do about it? Are we going to, for example, accept refugee claims or asylum claims from people who are citing climate change as a reason for having to leave their home countries? And if so, how are we going to manage such claims? In some instances, this is going to be a legal question for our own legal systems. But just in the past 3 months, I believe it was in late January, early February, the United Nations Human Rights Committee heard a claim from a person from Kiribati who was trying to avoid being deported from New Zealand back to his home country. His claim was based on climate-related damage to his home island, and the UN Human Rights Committee said that signatories to the UN Human Rights Convention should not be deporting people who are unable to return home because of climate change-related reasons. So it'll be interesting to see what will be the implications in the courts in Canada, the US, and elsewhere if this is raised. But I think a bigger question is, are we going to meet our international development goals, particularly the UN SDGs? Because given our current pathway towards more greenhouse gas emissions, the next best way to adapt our way out of this challenge we're creating for ourselves are the SDGs. To meet these goals, to increase the adaptive capacity, the economic and social development in low and middle income countries, because the theory being is if they are better able to adapt in other ways, we won't see large flows of people moving out of high-risk locations. But unfortunately, we're not doing terribly well on a lot of our SDGs as well. These are just a few images and graphics that I grabbed from the 2019 Sdg Progress Report. So for example, we have 1 out of 4 people in cities around the world living in slum-like conditions. We have 785 million people who lack basic drinking water. 2 out of 5 people worldwide do not have the ability to wash their hands with soap and water on a daily basis, a very big problem during a coronavirus outbreak, and others as well. We still have over 800 million people around the world living in hunger. So we are not doing a good job on the SDGs as well. Then, so are we going to try and do better? Are we going to try and at least target increased development assistance to countries or people living in locations that are high risk of being displaced for climate-related reasons? Or is it going to be part of broader development spending? There's a variety of ways we can talk about doing that. But one of the things that we see from research is that even when you increase development spending, it reduces disaster-related displacement, those sudden pulses of distress migration, but it does not decrease migration rates in general. You will still get migration, it just takes place under different circumstances. And since I feel like I've been talking a long time, I won't go into this particular story too much on the right-hand side of your screen, just to say that I was in Ethiopia a couple of years ago for IPCC-related work, and I met with Canada's International Development Commissioner there, who was talking about some projects that she was funding in Ethiopia that were taking very low-cost, high-impact strategies to help Ethiopians deal with a drought that was taking place at that time. And one of the things I noticed was that a lot of these strategies were the same strategies implemented in Canada and the United States back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s to make our farmers more resilient. And so getting towards the end of my presentation then, there's something on the table that I think is really being overlooked here. And it's something called the UN Global Compact on Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. This was a voluntary agreement that was brought forward at the United Nations, and it was approved about 2 years ago. And not all countries have signed off on it. The United States has not signed on it yet and says that it will not. I don't think Australia plans to, and several European countries do not. Canada has signed on to it, but it's not really taken action under it. But if you actually go into this document and look at it, it takes into account climate-related migration and displacement, and it offers a very clear and very logical blueprint for international policymakers to follow if they want to make migration part of the solution and not to treat it as something to be controlled and viewed as part of the problem. It gives a very clear outline of steps that can and should be taken to make migration safer for the migrants and their families themselves, but also for maximizing the benefits of migration to receiving communities and to sending communities as well. Because when done well and when managed and when done safely, migration can benefit everybody who's involved. And so rather than me sort of enumerating all the different things here, anybody who's interested, I would encourage you to have a look at that particular document. And so I feel like I've been talking a long time. I'm going to leave it at that. We are going to do a discussion now. And so I will turn this over, I think, to Professor Oppenheimer and Keely Swan as well, the hosts of this talk. And I would just like to thank you all for joining me. And those of you who have not fallen asleep yet at your computers or wandered off to grab a snack from the fridge, I would be happy to take any questions that you might have. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Robert. That was a terrific overview, and I'm going to applaud again. Let me start by the way, Robert's going to take his own questions. Let me just start in order to give the audience a little chance to think about what they want to ask you. Going to the last point, there's been a lot of discussion and tension within the migration community over the past 5 or 10 years about the question whether there ought to be a separate accord on what are called by some environmental refugees or climate refugees. I take it you see the recent UN compact as promising, although it is voluntary. There are no obligations that are binding. And I want to also say that the context in the background is that countries' attitudes on migration oscillate over time. The U.S. has sometimes been very welcoming, and sometimes, it's bar the doors, and I'm sure that's true of other countries as well. So, given that countries will do what's in their self-interest, that the extra amount they're willing to do for the general good of humanity is rather limited. What do you think about working towards a more comprehensive and binding accord and defining a class of migrants as climate refugees? Would that do any good?
Thank you, Michael. That's a great question and a very frequent one as well. And you're right, it is something that sort of challenges the international community on a variety of levels. Um, and quite frankly, I kind of oscillate back and forward on this myself, because in an ideal world, I think that it would be a good idea to create a separate class of migrants or protected people um, to deal with the reality that we are going to see more and more people being displaced from their homes in coming decades because of climate change. But the pragmatist in me looks at the fact that right now we have a widely accepted definition of what constitutes a refugee from conflict and persecution. And the international community does a terrible job of protecting people who meet that definition. So, for example, in Turkey right now, there's millions of people displaced from the Syrian conflict who find themselves squeezed between a rock and a hard place. They're not wanted in Turkey, but they're not allowed to move into the EU as well. And so I would hesitate to encourage the adoption of a new category of people who require protection until we do a better job dealing with the real refugee crisis that we have on an ongoing basis. I think the key thing is to, at this current moment in time, is to challenge the rhetoric that refugees and migrants are something to be feared or something to be, that to be controlled and prevented. Obviously, we should prevent the causes or stop the causes, the underlying causes of refugeeism and displacement, but the people themselves shouldn't be seen as the problem. And when I speak to policymakers, I try to emphasize those points I made in earlier slides, where when it is done well, when it is managed, when the access to migration systems is done in an orderly fashion, there are net benefits to be made or to be gained. And these benefits flow both ways. I know it's often been thought of in migration circles as a bit of a brain drain when you have people moving from low income to high income countries, but that tends to overlook things like remittances, return flows of migrants, movements of children and dependents, and so on. And if you look at the whole picture, there's a lot of examples of where it's done well and done freely. Migration can benefit all involved. And so what I try to encourage people to think about is not migration itself, but the conditions under which migration occurs. And we need to try to make those as beneficial to all involved as possible.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Let me just say for the audience that we have about, I'd say 15 minutes for Q&A. So ask away, be crisp, and we'll be able to cover everybody.
Okay, great. So I've been looking at the chat rooms. And so I see one from Mira. Hi, Mira. Can I say more about the UN High Commissioner of Refugee legal possibilities of climate refugee status? And I talked a little bit about that in my preceding answer, but I think we have to be very careful about mixing the term refugees with people who move for climate-related reasons for a couple things. One is that we do have a legal definition of refugees that is well recognized internationally. But also not all people who move for climate-related reasons are refugees. And a good example of this is the island of Kiribati. It's spelled Kiribati, but I'm told that the people who live there pronounce it as Kiribati. Their former president, Anote Tong, has talked about something called migration with dignity. Now, Kiribati is a low-lying Pacific atoll state where there is no land that's more than a meter or two above sea level. And so it is one of those countries that's on the front line of climate-related displacement. And President Tong said, essentially, we do not want the international community to think of us as refugees. We know how refugees are viewed by other countries, and we also know that they are not looked after very well by other countries. So we don't want you to think of us as potential refugees. And what he argues for instead is something called migration with dignity. And the idea behind that is that he says, look, why don't you make it easier for our young people to migrate to high-income countries like Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Australia? Let them come as students, let them come as workers. They'll develop skills, they'll improve their language skills and so on. They'll remit money home. We will use that money to try and build adaptive capacity here. And if the day comes down the road where we are no longer able to live on our island, we won't be refugees because you will want us. We will be skilled labor migrants who can plug right into your workforce. And so that's what he talks about, migration with dignity, and which to me sounds like a really great opportunity to work with high-risk, low-income countries. Unfortunately, in the international community, President Tong never really got a whole lot of uptake from potential recipients. But that's an example of why we need to be careful about conflating the current definition of refugee with the idea of climate migration more broadly. Okay, I've got a question from Kian, which is, I would also be interested in hearing what those 3 policy pathways would look like in practice. How does managed migration policy look? Are there good models? I'll give a little bit of a shout out to the Canadian immigration system here. For those who are not familiar with it, each year Canada has a target, and it's set by Parliament or by the Cabinet, what is going to be our annual migration target. And it oscillates from one year to the next, but right now it's in the 300,000s, the low 300,000 people. And so what we do is within that target of 300,000 odd people, we have a certain amount of people who we target as refugees who get relocated or resettled in Canada from abroad. We have people who show up in Canada and make what you would call asylum claims in the United States. We also have skilled workers who anybody in the world could, in theory, go to a Canadian embassy, put down their money, apply for immigration as a skilled worker, and we go through an order and take a certain number of those each year. And there's also entrepreneurial and other categories. But the point being is that we actually deliberately try to have an orderly intake of migrants every year. Now, it's not perfect. There's a number of gaps. For example, if you are a poor person in another country and don't have any particular skills, language or economic or otherwise, it's very difficult to get into Canada. But if you have a family member who can sponsor you, it's relatively easy. But the point being is that we have an open managed pipeline to do so. And I would encourage the Canadian government actually to expand it. But let's compare that or contrast that with, for example, how things work in Europe, where it is very difficult to become a permanent resident to European countries if you do not have any sort of blood ties or family ties to those countries. There's no way that you can simply say, hey, I'd like to immigrate to France and to apply through a legal channel. Or at least put it this way, there's very few ways that you can do so. If you're a doctor or a computer programmer, you might be able to, but otherwise not. So my point being is that orderly migration systems, there are a few that exist. And what you do is if you create a fair and accessible intake, you reduce the number of people who try to access your system through other ways, through undocumented migration as well. And if all countries were doing this, at least if all high-income countries were taking such an approach, I think you would see a lot fewer incidences of distress migration and undocumented migration as well. Okay, next question is from Helen. Do I think in the future migrants will start mentioning climate change more as a reason for leaving their home countries? The answer is that depends a lot on the country to which they are seeking entry. Right now, if you were to go to Canada or the United States and say, hi, I'm a climate change migrant, could I please have asylum? You would probably be turned around and sent back to where you came from. But will it happen more often? I think it depends a lot on our own legal systems because they, in the end, will make those decisions in some ways for us. So, for example, if you show up at the Canadian border and say, I would like to make a refugee claim here in Canada, and that might be coming from the United States or it might be arriving at a Canadian airport, we have a system that you go through. Your case is documented. It goes into an administrative system where an adjudicator will make a decision on your refugee claim. And if in that system, and they are bound by legal precedents, if in that system they decide to draw upon the UN Human Rights Committee decision of this past year and say, yeah, climate change is a valid reason for making a refugee claim here in Canada, then it will probably start to attract more people making similar claims. Because remember, at the end of the day, we have these international agreements like the UN Refugee Convention but it's up to every country to make its own interpretation of those agreements. And if the United States or Canada or Mexico or someone else wants to broaden the interpretation, that is part of their sovereign right to do so. So I think that in many instances, that might be one of the drivers of how people start to frame their asylum claims. On the other hand, if a country like Kiribati or Vanuatu or Tuvalu, if people need to leave, I don't think people are going to beat around the bush. They're going to say, look, I need to flee for climate-related reasons, and they will do so. Got a question from Nicholas, which says, under what conditions does migration seem as a complement to other adaptation strategies through remittances, and when does it serve as a substitute? That's a wonderful question. And indeed, I often talk about a continuum of adaptation where migration plays a role within that. There's a number of different cases I'm familiar with which have been investigated by this. Are in this sort of context. So if you look at, for example, parts of the world where drought is a key driver of migration. So sub-Saharan Africa, for example, parts of South Asia, India, even Bangladesh, they have drought-related migration there. What you will often see is that people will adapt through a variety of ways that are sort of localized adaptation. So for example, farmers may change the timing or choice of crops. They may sell off livestock, they may purchase livestock depending on market conditions. They try to make local level adjustments to their livelihoods. But at the same time, if they see that there's not enough work for everybody on the farm, then the young men, or depending on the culture, the young women as well, will head to the nearest city and look for wage labor that they'll then remit back home. When the sort of agricultural conditions improve again, then they themselves may actually come back to the farm or to the home, and when their labor is needed once again. In West Africa, they refer to this as a phenomena called eating the dry season. So very common in very dry years for people to do this sort of thing. And so this short-term labor migration is part of a larger set of risk management strategies, if you will, that households will develop to try and negotiate difficult times. And they may do it not just in terms of difficult climatic times, but also difficult financial times, economic risks, or others as well. And there's a very long-standing theory by a guy named Oded Stark, who started writing about this back in the 70s, which is called The New Economics of Labor Migration. And so he was the one who looked at migration not so much as a push-pull, but more as a household-level adaptation strategy. So thanks for that question, Nicholas. Next question from someone by the last name of Sanchez. Thank you for the question. Very important to accentuate the need to change the narrative vis-a-vis migration. So I think that's agreement with some slides I had earlier, where especially in in the United States, Australia, the EU right now, there's a lot of fear, if you will, about migration and being overwhelmed by large numbers of migrants, and to talk about the need to keep people out, and not just keep people out of the United States or keep them out of the EU, but pressuring transit countries like Mexico, Libya, and other parts of the world to try and pressure them to also close their borders to migrants and sort of shut these networks down. And that's very worrisome as well, because, for example, if you look at the context of Libya, where the EU and Italy in particular is sending back boats of migrants who are trying to get across the Mediterranean back to Libya. Libya is a country with very, very fragmented government structures, a lot of competing factions for political power, and very low human rights regime right now in Libya. And so when you return migrants to a country like Libya, you are essentially ignoring your own respect for human rights, your own being a signatory to the UN Human Rights Convention, and putting people under extreme risk as well. So it's not enough to simply close your eyes and close the borders. These are people, they're human beings we're talking about, and it has implications for their welfare. So I agree with the comment that we really do need to change the narrative about migration very rapidly. Another question from Christopher Crawford, which relates to the interaction between agriculture and climate migration. And I mentioned that droughts will likely lead to longer-term migration. Is this primarily due to declining agricultural viability, and how do I see climate-driven migration playing a role in reorganizing agriculture, especially in drought-prone regions? So yes, that's a great question, Christopher. There's a bunch of things going on with the agricultural sector, especially in low-income countries. Of course, you have these climate-related risks that are taking place, but you also have agricultural restructuring. You have large amounts of migration already taking place in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, from rural areas to cities as the agricultural system itself changes from a traditional or subsistence-based agricultural system to a market-oriented agricultural system, sort of a mirroring of what we saw in Western North America from the early part of the 20th century to the later part of the 20th century, where you went from family-dominated small-scale farming in Western North America to large corporate, although the corporations are mostly family-owned, but large, more industrialized, mechanized agriculture, which has less need for labor and more need for capital. And that's what's starting to unfold in many parts of South Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America. You have farms getting bigger, less need for labor, which is helping to push more migrants into cities. And then you're going to layer climate change on top of that, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, the impacts of climate change on water supplies and precipitation patterns. And so you're going to see a couple ways in which climate sort of becomes a stress multiplier, if you will, in these countries. First is that you're going to have these periodic drought events that cause local loss of income to farmers and farm families, but also an increase in the price of food and scarcity of food in poorer countries where households have this sort of double whammy of income going down and prices going up as well. So I see it as almost being like a compounding factor in coming decades, sort of piggybacking on top of the inevitable economic restructuring of agriculture in low-income countries to help amplify the amount of internal migration within countries. Now, there may also be a knock-on effect in migration to neighboring countries, contiguous ones, and farther afield, but I sort of see it sort of bundling into that. I'm gonna, whenever I see Michael and Keely sort of put on their video and wave at me, I'll know that it's time to stop taking questions. In the meantime, I'll just keep going through them. What countries are handling migration well is a question from Judith. I'd be interested to hear anybody else who has an opinion on that. Not many. I think that in terms of well, I think we could look at in terms of which countries are doing the least worst jobs of managing migration. There's not a lot even doing it in that context. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Canadian system. It has its warts and weaknesses, but so far it's doing reasonably well. Yeah, in Europe right now, if you look at, I mean, if you talk about high-income countries, there are very few high-income countries that are being open and looking at migration as an opportunity or as a way of building development. Most high-income countries, Australia, EU, United States, and others, are trying to control migration. And so, to be honest, I don't want to start awarding bronze medals to anybody for handling migration well. I think we're all doing fairly poorly. Michael, should I take one more question and leave it at that?
Yes, let's let that one be the last.
That one's the last? Okay. So I'll turn it back to you then, Michael.
Oh, no. What I meant was you can take that last question.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is from Jared, who asks the question, how do you see the politics of migration playing out going forward, especially against the backdrop of rising right-wing anti-immigrant politics and politicians? And to what extent do I see the 2015 surge in refugees to Europe and resulting political backlash as a harbinger of things to come? I'm going to try and end on an optimistic note, even though it's not necessarily always easy to do so when you're talking about things. Absolutely, the 2015 influx of migrants into Europe has very much colored European migration policy since that time, and you see a lot of investment in trying to prevent migration from happening. And yes, I do look south of the border of the United States, and I don't like the anti-immigrant rhetoric that I often hear from certain politicians. But as Michael mentioned in his opening remarks, politics change, especially here in North America. They change every 4 years, potentially, certainly every 8 years. And so there are ebbs and flows. And I think that the reality is going to be is that the lack of immigration and the aging of populations in high-income countries is going to force governments to look at migration as something that should be managed and done in an effective fashion. Because the reality is this, is that 20 years from now, there's going to be a whole bunch of senior citizens in Canada, increasing numbers of them in the United States, and very large numbers of them in Western Europe. And so it gets to be the point where the economy starts to actually slow down if you don't have influxes of people. So that would be the sort of silver lining I see in all of this, is that we will see migration. We will have to see migration as a potential for economic gain. And I'm going to leave it at that.
Great. Okay, let's see. I'm going to unmute Michael as well so he can, let's see. There we
Okay.
go. We're both unmuted.
Okay, I
Just
got it.
Okay. Do you want to wrap things up for us, Michael?
Sure. Thank you, Robert, for a very interesting, comprehensive, and insightful presentation. We hope we can have you back live sometime in the next couple of years. And in the meantime, to you and to the audience, I hope that this proved to be effective. We'd like to hear from you by email to Keely to let us know what the experience was like for you and whether there are any adjustments that we need to make. And so to all of you, have a good day. Everybody do what they're supposed to do to stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you all.